Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us at day 2 of From Classroom to Boardroom, a virtual event series addressing issues of race and equity in the workplace and highlighting programs and policies for an equitable economic recovery in communities across the country. Thank you to the United Way of Greater Charlottesville, the University of Virginia, and the Virginia Tourism Corporation for their support in bringing this program to life, as well as countless other program and partner collaborations in our hometown and beyond. Today's panel is titled Recovering Up: How New Job Growth Industries Can Drive Equity and Economic Opportunity. And I am so thrilled to introduce our moderator, Rachel Korberg, Program Officer at the Ford Foundation and incoming Executive Director at Families and Workers Fund. Rachel, I'll hand things over to you.
Thank you, Ben. Hello, everybody. I am really glad to be here having this conversation today. We're going to talk about what an equitable jobs recovery really looks like and how we deliver on that. The history of economic crises and downturns in the US is a history that has too often left those who are already the least secure coming out in a worse position. So recoveries have often centered those who went in with the greatest opportunity and the greatest privileges. So recovering up means that we don't do that we don't continue that trajectory, that we center those who have been most locked out of opportunity, not only during the pandemic, but also before in our jobs recovery. So I'm going to share a couple of stats that bring this situation to life right now. Since the start of the pandemic, more than 50 million people have experienced unemployment at some point. While we're hearing, especially today, a lot of positive economic indicators and the vaccine rollout is certainly encouraging and inspiring, the story does not look as good when you bring in age, gender, race, ethnicity. So for example, young Black women face unemployment rates of up to 20% versus 4.8% for middle-aged white men. So you have one group that's essentially living in the Great Depression, right? In the Great Depression, unemployment reached about 24%. And you have another group that's in what economists would describe as a healthy, normal labor market. So we've already, another important stat here, we've already said that 50 million people experienced unemployment at some point, yet nationwide employee compensation, so everything that goes to employee pay, it only decreased by 0.5%. And that's because the layoffs were really concentrated in the jobs that were already the lowest paid. So people who were already struggling, being hardest hit. For those of us who are in higher paying jobs, those jobs you're much more likely to be able to work remotely. The industries in many cases have already rebounded if they were harmed in the first place. So this is how we are in a situation now where you have some all-time highs in the stock market over the past 12 months and a spike in shoplifting baby food and baby diapers. These are two realities that are coexisting in our country right now. So we need to deliver jobs in this recovery, but we need to deliver quality jobs, and we need to deliver them to the people who are low income, who are Black, Indigenous, Latinx, AAPI, other people of color, women, LGBTQ folks, immigrants, everyone who has been locked out of opportunity and who has been hardest hit in this pandemic. So to unpack this really critical topic, I'm thrilled that we have Saket Sunny, Della Clark, and Emily Tim. Each of you are brilliant visionary leaders that are leading very different work in this space. So let's go ahead and dive right in. I'm going to ask each of you to please share your organization and role and how you're delivering high quality jobs. And we'll start with you, Saket. Oh, Saket, you're on mute.
Oops, sorry. Thank you.
Someone had to do it. It's the right way to kick off a panel.
Only way, absolutely. Thank you, Rachel, for convening this discussion. Thanks to Tom for providing this really timely forum, and really excited to think through this with all of you. I'm Saket Soni. I'm the Executive Director of Resilience Force, and we are an organization and a rising workforce that has its roots in the post-Katrina Gulf Coast. In the last 15 years, we have seen disaster after disaster. Climate change has driven more frequent and more destructive floods and fires and hurricanes. Many of you are calling in from places like Texas, the broader Southeast region, Michigan, California, Louisiana, of course, that even in the last year have sustained enormous damage through these climate-driven disasters. And as these disasters have increased, millions of people have started to feel the need for resilience. Resilience has grown to become an American priority, a priority of the majority. Even people who continue to deny the role of climate change nonetheless accept that our social infrastructure and our physical infrastructure need to be more adaptive to our climate realities to face the next fire. We can't just build back to where we were. We have to build better. So that's the basis of the rise of a whole new workforce that we call the resilience workforce. These are people who rebuild after floods, fires, and hurricanes, but they also build year-round to make our lived environment more adaptive to the next disaster. And so we've been trying to build up and formalize this workforce. We've been trying to work with cities across the country, particularly in the course of the pandemic. And an example of where we've done this and produced high quality jobs is once the pandemic was underway, we went back to New Orleans and we partnered with the city and built a public-private partnership where we took out of work service sector workers who lost their minimum wage, $7.25 an hour jobs. And we've retrained them to become resilience workers, where they're working on both pandemic care and climate adaptation. These are workers who are working as community health workers. We have newer cohorts planned who will be working on disaster preparation. And these are people who have gone for $7.25 an hour and are now being trained to do $12 an hour jobs on a path to 18. We believe that resilience is an entire economy. It's an over $200 billion economy with an enormous amounts of public funds coming into it. Chances are, if you're in one of half of the zip codes in America in the next 4 years, your city will receive $1 billion or more in public funds to create jobs, to produce American resilience. And we believe that's really a pathway for the structurally unemployed, for the long-term unemployed, both in construction and maintenance and in healthcare and emergency services. So that's a little bit about what we've been doing.
Thank you so much, Saket. I'm really excited to dig in more to that. Let's go over to Emily.
Great, thank you. Good afternoon. I think it's afternoon most places. And I really appreciate, Rachel, the opportunity to participate in this really important conversation, and to the TomTom Foundation for hosting it. So thank you so much for that. My name is Emily Tim. I am the co-founder and a co-executive director of the Workers' Defense Project. We are a Texas-based worker center. We are a membership-based organization that is building power for low-wage workers and immigrants in Texas in order to win safe, dignified working conditions. We operate out of Austin, Dallas, and Houston, and we have a strategic focus on the construction industry because it is one of the largest employers of immigrant workers and low-wage workers in Texas, and has an outsized influence on Texas politics and the Texas economy. So construction work, as Rachel alluded to, construction work was not good work before the pandemic. It's particularly in the Texas industry, workers were already often earning poverty wages or well below a living wage. They were facing dangerous and deadly conditions. Studies have found that a worker dies in Texas, in the Texas construction industry, every 3 days, and that 1 out of 5 workers in Texas has been injured on the job. and over half of the industry makes below a living wage. So we're looking at workers who were already, before the pandemic, before this most recent crisis, were already one paycheck away from economic disaster for their families. And so we know that there's sort of these structural issues that preceded the crisis and preceded the pandemic around creating economic instability, creating jobs that force workers to put their lives at risk every single day. And so as we're thinking about recovery, we need to be thinking about, again, how do we not go back to normal, because normal was not working for Texas construction workers and their families. How do we think about how can these become good construction jobs, and how can these become career pathways that actually lift families out of poverty? So our members fight back against systemic abuse at the workplace. We advocate for policies that raise the floor in construction and in other low wage sectors. Over the years, we've been able to pass policies that maybe seem so basic, even things like requiring paid sick leave, providing rest breaks for construction workers who are working in triple-digit weather on a daily basis, where that wasn't a given protection. But after many years of campaigning to address labor abuses, we also knew that we weren't going to make systemic change in the construction industry unless we created a high road alternative to these dead-end construction jobs that so many workers were stuck in. And so our members came together to create the Better Builder program. The Better Builder program is a worker-driven corporate social responsibility program that raises standards and creates good jobs in the construction industry. We know from our years of experience doing work around construction that the Better Builder program really recognizes that the construction industry is the original gig economy. We like to say that construction sort of invented the misclassification of workers as independent contractors and creating these jobs where people are really sort of itinerant workers. And so even while people are doing the work of employees, they're not enjoying the benefits and protections that employees traditionally and historically have enjoyed. So we also know that within construction, the structure of subcontracting and the competitive bid system incentivizes companies to lower their costs by pushing the costs of fair wages, safety training, benefits down to the smallest subcontractors who are the least able to provide for these needs, but end up employing most of the workers on a site. And so because of these realities, the Better Builder program strategically partners with developers and end users. So that can be a city, a county, the federal government, schools, all of sort of the public end users out there, and also private end users, hotels, affordable housing developers, in order to establish standards and to raise standards on a specific work site for all construction workers. And so developers or end users sign a Better Builder pledge that commits them to meeting those minimum standards on their site: a living wage, workers' compensation coverage, which is optional in Texas, and providing OSHA safety trainings for both workers and managers. And then the key piece of all of this, in addition to creating training opportunities and career paths, is that there's independent third-party monitoring to actually raise standards. And so in this moment where we're thinking about what does it look like to recover up, and we've seen where the Better Builder program has been successful on about $2 billion worth of construction in Texas and improving conditions for 30,000 workers over the past few years, that this is a model that if we're applying this to recovery, if we're applying this to public funding going into construction and to other private sector opportunities to harness the potential in the construction industry, which in Texas is a $96 billion sector, that this can be a real way to raise standards and actually create good jobs in the construction industry, and needs to be a critical piece of how we think about recovering up in this moment. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Emily. Della, over to you.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. And I'm also delighted to join this distinguished panel and to be with you again, Rachel. I am president of a nonprofit organization in Philadelphia called the Enterprise Center. And so I'm going to share with you kind of the Philadelphia story. And Philadelphia happens to be one of our larger cities based on percentage of population, one of the largest African-American concentrated populations in America. And it happens to be one of our larger cities with one of the highest poverty rates. And so when you look back over the history of Philadelphia, it is an old city. We were in the industrial age, but we have missed every other age that have come since then. And we have the leftover baggage of that industrial age. So we missed the technology world. We missed a lot of worlds. And so, but we did not miss the pandemic, okay? It has hit us pretty hard. And so the Enterprise Center is about 32 years old, and we have transformed in many different ways over the 32 years. We started out helping primarily people of color start a business, and then we went to helping them scale a business. But now we are laser focused on creating wealth and using all of our track record and past performance to change the conversation that we're having with the public sector, the private sector, and entrepreneurs themselves. And so we are primarily focused in three areas. One is we ourselves have had to build what we call a program and advisory management team. And that is a group of people who serve as an extension for our small businesses. And we are now building out a shared office service component as well with that. And so we recognize that many of our small businesses are undercapitalized and cannot afford to have a strong management team. And so we've had to build supplementary expertise to assist our clients. The second thing that we serve as is an intermediary for capital and contracts. Philadelphia happens to be rich in anchor institutions, universities, medical, and so we serve as an intermediary to help our clients with contract opportunities. And so just to give you a sense, over the past 7 years, we helped our clients generate about 600 million in contracts and about 31 million in capital. And then finally, where we're laser focused today is on community wealth. And I'll just give you a couple of quick examples of how we have helped to transform these three areas of advisory services, capital, contracts with wealth. So as you think about it, the janitorial industry was hit very hard when we all had to work from home, because these small office buildings and office complexes no longer was using janitorial services. When you looked at the profile of janitorial services in Philadelphia, it primarily was women-owned, and mostly employees were family members. And so they were hit very hard by the pandemic and result of working from home. And so as we began to learn, we had a client that was an engineer, and he was working on how do we disinfect public spaces. And he created a new division of his company called Disinfect US, which is where you use a product and a technology out of the food industry to clean public spaces, to disinfect from bacteria. And so we were able to marry his business concept with the janitorial, and we went after a public contract from our Commonwealth of Pennsylvania to clean 6.2 million square feet at our Capitol building in Harrisburg. So what we did was, these janitorial firms in the Harrisburg area were paying $7 an hour. Most of them were paying what I would call under the table. They were not keeping very good books. And so what we did was, in terms of our client, we brought to the table our program management system. We worked out with each one of the janitorial firms that we would award them a contract. They would have to pay $17 an hour. They would have to pay health benefits, and we would compensate them for those additional benefits to their businesses. So we were able to work out with the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania that each business would get $44 an hour to be able to move downstream in terms of building their business infrastructure, building their capacity. And so I am pleased to report, after 6 months with this private partnership, we had the contract renewed another 6 months. And these small businesses are delighted to be able to offer health benefits and build their capacity of their business. And it's just an example of how you need the public sector in some cases to help transform some of the small businesses. Another example to give you how this has worked is around we recognize, and Emily, you alluded to this in the construction industry, we too have encountered tremendous amount of problems with getting minority participation on construction projects. We find that minority contractors are the subs of subs of subs. They're the last to get paid. They're at the bottom of the totem pole. Usually they're just temporary staffing for the larger construction firms. So we decided we needed to get into the real estate business. So we currently own 5 buildings. We just recently purchased a small building that we're going to use 100 minority percent firms to do this building. We got the largest janitorial firm in Philadelphia called Driscoll to be our partner. They will not be the GC, but they will be a mentor to us. And we're going to award the contracts directly so that we can have 100% minority participation. It is in an underserved community. It is on a distressed commercial corridor. And we're hoping to model for the future how commercial corridors should be rebuilt from the community. And so when we put out our RFP, we're only going to hire people from the zip code where the building is located. And we're only going to hire contractors from the zip code where the building is located. So we look at this as a targeted opportunity, a targeted community, bringing together the resources. We have the union that will stand down on the project, and we will make sure that every contractor pay their employees meaningful wages with health benefits, because it's our dollars we bring into the table. And so we feel we can drive that process. And in closing, the only other project that I want to mention where we've had a tremendous amount of opportunity is around the food industry. We've operated a commercial kitchen for 10 years. And I'll be honest with all of you, when we got into the food business, we knew absolutely nothing about food. And we didn't know how difficult it was to operate a commercial kitchen. But looking back over in the 10 years we've been operating it, it's one of the best decisions we've ever made. Because of the anchor institutions that are nearby a commercial kitchen, it also was a great way, because when you look at universities, even though they're in a virtual environment now, but when the students are there, they consume a lot of food. They consume a lot of baked goods, and they want to eat healthy. And so it was a great way to marry our small food producers with the university's food service companies, which is the Aramarks, the Bon Appetits, Sodexos of the world. And so for the past 10 years, we've enjoyed a tremendous partnership with them. And I often joke that we go around with little signs at the university saying, "Eat up," you know, because we want to make sure that our small food producers, most of their contracts all come from anchor institutions in our city. So these are just some examples of the Philadelphia story. But lastly, I want to leave you with is that there's about 30,000 minority Black and brown businesses in Philadelphia, but less than, I'd say 5% of them have significant employees. Most of them are sole proprietors. And that is one of the challenges that we're faced with the future, in that how do we take these little mice and grow them into elephants so that they can lead the way in their respective community in terms of creating the jobs, because we think the jobs are going to come from small businesses and not from the big employers. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Della. It's so interesting in listening to each of you, because we're talking about construction, a range of small businesses, and the resilience economy. So, 3 different spaces, yet all of you are creating opportunity for people who have been locked out of it by tapping a shared set of levers of change. It's not any one thing. And in what each of you shared, I hear leveraging market forces and business partnerships, policy, training and workforce, and also worker and community organizing, and making sure these interventions are really designed with and for the people for whom they're intended. So I think that's a really interesting commonality across your stories. So, continuing to think about the kind of bigger picture takeaways that your work really can offer for the country as we all navigate this recovery period, I want to ask each of you to share one lesson from your work that you think could help to shape a more equitable recovery. So this time, let's start with you, Emily.
Great. Happy to do that. And Della, that's so exciting to hear about the construction work and how you guys have gotten into real estate. It actually dovetails well with the point I wanted to make. And one of the key lessons we've learned is that the Better Builder model is really a program that is good for end users and for the construction companies as well, that it reduces labor and safety issues on their sites. It avoids costly slowdowns due to unpaid wage cases or work stoppages when a deadly accident occurs. And that it's really, we've been able to partner with like other mission aligned type developers in the past, like affordable housing developers or cities where the feel that the values of the Better Builder program align with their values as a city. And so there's been this opportunity to see that it's really great for furthering the mission of sometimes the end user themselves in terms of lifting people out of poverty, creating good jobs that help to alleviate housing issues for an affordable housing developer, for example. And that it's also an opportunity for highlighting those good construction conditions and showing sort of the public relations side of like showing that it is possible to create good jobs in the construction industry and that there's a benefit for both end users, developers, construction firms along the way. The other piece that I think really illustrated how critically important a role a model like Better Builder that really is a partnership with developers but also created and driven by workers themselves who can best identify what the needs are on a work site is, I think COVID-19 itself really illustrates this well, that we saw that at the outset of the pandemic, that city officials in Austin, where one of the cities where we have a number of Better Builder programs, that city officials in Austin actually implemented measures to protect construction workers and even considered temporarily closing some work sites to keep workers safe from COVID-19. But then we saw that there was a difference of opinion in our state leadership, who then sort of at the behest of large firms and other more corporate actors tied the hands of local authorities to implement measures to protect workers and the public, like prohibiting mask mandates, forcing businesses to stay open and to continue to operate. And so this weighed heavily on construction workers. And so all of our fears around what construction workers as some of the most vulnerable populations, both in terms of demographics and in terms of worksite exposure would face, we saw that by August of last year, that construction workers were 5 times as likely to be hospitalized for COVID as workers in other sectors, because these well-intentioned city interventions were not able to be fully realized. Now, in contrast, on Better Builder sites, our third-party independent monitoring, the Better Builder monitoring program, was able to implement work-safe measures that were undermined by this sort of back and forth between local and state government that was happening, and that there was this opportunity to educate workers about COVID-19 spread prevention measures, and to educate and implement these best practices to minimize the spread of COVID on those sites. And so in that sense, there was this ability of the Better Builder program to also be more responsive to the emerging needs of keeping workers safe and to work in partnership to ensure that workers were safe on the job. And again, I think that we've seen that this can be a model for harnessing recovery funds to create good jobs in sort of the resilience sector, like what Saket was talking about and describing. And we were able, one of our offices is Houston based. And so in the wake of Hurricane Harvey, we were able to work with city and county officials to ensure that when there was federal funding and public funding coming in to support rebuilding, particularly residential homes that were destroyed in the hurricane, that they were built with Better Builder standards, that these recovery and resilience type jobs did create good jobs in the construction sector, that frankly the housing market and the housing side of single family housing of the construction sector tends to be very like have fewer benefits, have fewer protections, and lower pay than the commercial sector. And so it was able to help make those good jobs, so that as families and workers themselves who lived in the Houston area were recovering from this terrible crisis of Hurricane Harvey, that they were also having the opportunity to move into jobs that were good construction jobs while they were rebuilding their community. And that really doing that work as sort of second responders, so maybe they weren't on the front line, but they were the ones who came behind the natural disaster and the climate crisis disaster to really help rebuild our community, and that they were able to do that and actually themselves move out of poverty in order to do that critical work. So.
Thank you so much, Emily. Della, we'll go to you next. What's one broader lesson learned from your work that you think could inform the country's equitable jobs recovery?
I think, Rachel, we started to look at our distressed communities and started to compare them to prosperous communities. And so when you think about jobs and workers, if you are from a prosperous community, you have networks that you can tap into if you lose your job or you need a new opportunity. Whereas if you're in a distressed community, you don't have those networks. And so I think that there is a clear delineation between communities where there has low wealth accumulation versus prosperous community where there is a concentration of opportunities. And one of the biggest takeaways is that in underserved communities, we think too much about training programs and workforce development versus thinking about direct response to individual needs. And I think our biggest takeaway is that we need to transfer some of the dollars that is being spent on training and put those dollars, in our opinion, to actually helping people fish for themselves, which is small businesses, and because I think for the future, in terms of the pivot from the pandemic, there's going to be a lot more outsourcing rather than beefing up staff. And it's a real opportunity for small businesses to participate in the new economy.
Thank you, Della. I really appreciate that. And not that training isn't one important part of solutions, but the focus on it as the central strategy so often suggests that we're in this situation of such profound inequity because the individual people don't have the talent and skills, and that just couldn't be further from the truth. So it feels like we're trying to solve the wrong problem when we focus so much on training.
Correct.
Saket, over to you for a lesson learned for an equitable jobs recovery.
Yeah, sure. Maybe a two-part lesson. One is just that, this pandemic is really intense, it's long, but it's also only a dress rehearsal for what's coming. Many of our communities, probably half the zip codes in America, will live in climate volatility year after year on a cyclical basis for the decade to come. So much of what we had to learn during the pandemic, we will need to apply year after year in half the zip codes in America. It's important, therefore, to just derive the first lesson, which is that recoveries can either build assets for communities of color and poor people, or those same recoveries can strip away assets. And right now, the way the United States of America does recovery under the rules of the Stafford Act and the operating rules of FEMA and other agencies, recoveries largely strip away assets. They are not wealth producers for poor people and people of color. They are, however, wealth producers for, for already wealthy and mostly white homeowners. So that's one important thing. And if you're a national foundation, we are thinking a lot about next 4 years, how to rewrite the rules of federal recovery, and are building playbooks for federal recovery so that recoveries, by the time they get down to Houston or Philadelphia or New Orleans or wherever else, Baltimore, anywhere in Virginia, that those recoveries can spur racial justice and wealth building. The second part of that lesson is that implementation matters. it's not just what the policies are. Recovery policy, and particularly equitable recovery policy, is federal in its origin, but it's deeply local in its endpoint. And the true test of it is in the implementation. The kinds of jobs Emily's talking about, or Della is talking about, or that I'm talking about, could easily be AmeriCorps-style low-wage jobs, if that's the bar we decide. Or we could lift the bar. And so in New Orleans, we've created an $18 an hour bar, and up from there. So if you're a local foundation, you likely have grantees who have volunteers doing outreach. All of those volunteers could, in our model, become resilience workers funded by the federal government. If you are a local worker center, a local community organization with about 100, 200 volunteers, think about how those volunteers could translate into the resilience workers of that community. Because that's really the opening, is that local partners are going to be needed in the implementation of equitable recovery. And we need to start positioning local organizations to be those implementation partners in the municipalities. We've done that on the federal end and in New Orleans. We've seen both sides of the chain through the pandemic, and we'd love to help in other localities going forward. But those are some of the lessons, other than the more optimistic lesson that it is possible. It is possible to turn recovery into an engine for policy change, culture change, and raising the bar of standards for poor people and the working class.
Thank you so much, Saket. And I appreciate you starting on the point of the pandemic being a dress rehearsal for what's to come, but ending on what was a really profoundly inspiring note. I want to invite everyone who's joining us to drop any questions or reflections into the chat. We'll start to turn to those now. And in the meantime, Saket, I wanted to come to you again with a follow-up question, which is really, to better understand what these resilience jobs of the future are, to give us a little bit more texture. So, given everything that's happening in our economy, this stratification of high pay and low pay jobs, the growth of contract jobs, service industry, what are the jobs of the future on the ground? What do they really look like? And how are you trying to shape that trajectory?
Well, resilience is now, especially after the unprecedented fires, floods, and hurricanes of the last few years and the pandemic of the last year, resilience is among the #1 priorities of most mayors and governors in America across political divides and across the ideological spectrum. Because on the ground, there are felt needs, and there is absolutely no doubt that a workforce is needed to meet those needs. So we look at resilience in sort of 4 ways. There's construction and maintenance. Last year, there were 2 hurricanes in 6 weeks in Louisiana, creating billions of dollars in damage. And schools, hospitals, homes were rebuilt by our members, by resilience workers. There's health, and particularly emergency health. We have, cohorts of community health workers walking around persuading people in New Orleans to take the vaccine, to overcome hesitancy, and overcome the justifiable, questions about safety, as well as to go to the elderly, the essential workers, those whose work schedules may not allow for the vaccine, or whose care situation might make the vaccine harder. That's an example of resilience work, the kind of outreach, bringing health to your doorstep. A third kind of resilience work is emergency services. A fourth is just normal social services that break down during a disaster and need to be taken care of. So there are this is the spectrum, and the exciting thing, which I get to announce today for the first time in this forum is, are you ready? Just today, President Biden's released jobs plan for America for the first time includes resilience workers. The first time that a president has acknowledged this as a formal sector for billions in American investment. The plan includes a dedication to mobilizing the next generation of resilience workers. It's in a category that will include a $10 billion investment. That includes conservation, but it also includes all of these needs that I've just laid out. So that's what the jobs look like. We're in a moment where the American government has recognized the need for the workforce, and small businesses survive on those workers arriving to raise them up. So there's a confluence going on, and you know, we think that this is really an opportunity when the workforce is such a felt need. That's exactly when the workers have the greatest advantage to ask for high wages and good benefits. So that's the other opportunity that we have an invitation to take.
Thanks so much, Saket. That's really powerful. So we're getting some great questions in the chat. Emily, I want to come to you with one from Lindsay Walsh. Lindsay, thanks for the question. How do you connect directly with the folks that you're trying to reach? How do workers have access to these opportunities? How do you design with them? And I happen to know that Workers Defense does this in a really brilliant way and have seen it firsthand. So I'm excited to ask you the question.
Yeah, no, thank you for this question, Lindsay, and for pitching it to me, Rachel. I was jotting down my thoughts on it when I saw it pop up in the chat. And just full disclosure, I have a small visitor, so I apologize if I am distracted. So great. So this feels like such a critical part of what we need to be thinking about, and when we're defining what recovering up means. I think part of the issue that, like, we're talking about these historical, deep structural inequalities and problems with some of the low-wage work sectors that we're discussing, like construction, among others. And I think a piece of it has to do with worker voice and worker power within those sectors. And so as we're thinking through what do these solutions look like, I think it's critical that workers themselves are part of the partnership and the conversation around what those solutions look like. And I think, like, the Better Builder program is a key piece of that it's rooted in the experiences of longtime workers in the construction industry, that it's repeatedly revisited and revised in conversation with those construction workers, and that's a key piece for whatever sector we're talking about, for resilience work, that there needs to be that those systems and those processes and ways that workers are being consulted and being part of the actual designing what these jobs need to look like, and what are the most urgent needs in, and it can also be localized. What's really a priority and needed in one geography might be slightly different than what's a priority and needed in another geography. So that's a really important component. I think one of the other ways that we've been thinking about this is working again, in the COVID context, which is sort of a good go-to example of thinking about how essential workers and frontline workers need to be part of designing those local solutions and those local protections for work safe guidelines, and have a piece of, like, making sure that they're upheld in order for them to be really fully effective. And that's some work we're doing, some interesting multi-sectoral work experimenting with in Harris County, where Houston's located. But I think is, like, a key principle and a key model for how we need to be thinking about this work, and what is the ongoing mechanisms that government and public sector and private sector and community organizations, as in partnership, are thinking about how to actually be engaging the folks who the policies are being designed by and for to benefit.
Thanks so much, Emily. We have another question from Ray Ransom. Thank you for the question. That Della, I thought would be a good one to start with you. The question is basically, how do small businesses, especially those that are owned by Black, Indigenous, people of color, or women connect to business opportunities. The question mentioned the resilience economy in particular, but I think opportunities more broadly. And I wondered if I could invite you in particular, since we have many people joining us who are either part of city government or academic institutions, to share with us a little bit more about that anchor institution consortium that the Enterprise Center was part of creating, and the way you've really mobilized major anchor institutions like UPenn and Drexel to dedicate more of their procurement spend to these businesses.
Mm-hmm. Well, the only way that small minority businesses can get access to these contract opportunities, whether they're part of the resilience economy or just in general, is that you have to have an intermediary. You need someone from a service provider, from a organization, whether it's a for-profit or nonprofit, who serves as that intermediary. Goes and assemble the supply side, which is the small business side, understand the capacity of those small businesses, organize them in such a way that when you go out and broker them to the larger, both public and private sector, you're able to match make them in such a way that awards them contracts, you're able to align capital with them, and you also fulfill a need of the anchor institution. Keep in mind that anchor institutions are not going to award a contract to a small disadvantaged business if they don't think they can fulfill it, because they don't want to put themselves in a position. So just as an example, toilet paper. You're not going to buy toilet paper and not get a delivery when you got 25,000 kids at the university. So, you have to understand your supply side, which is comprised of the minority businesses. And so we at the Enterprise Center, we have full-time staff that's all that they do, is network both sides of the aisle. One side works on the supply side, the other side work on the anchor institutions. And what we consider ourselves to be is a boutique matchmaker, not a cattle call matchmaker. We do not put out outreach and have 500 people come to meet anchor institutions. We find out what the needs of the anchor institutions are, and we specifically match make according to the size and scale of that opportunity and align those minority businesses, because we want the minority businesses to be happy that they were matched with a real opportunity. So just to give you an example, there's a bank in town with 50 branches. They came to us because they wanted to get a janitorial firm. So we said, award us the contract for the janitorial, and then we will outsource it based on the size and scale of the branches to the small janitorial firm. So oftentimes we will step in with our program management system and serve as an additional intermediary for the contracts, because the bank doesn't want to award 50 small janitorial firms 50 different contracts, but they have the trust and confidence in us that we would align them. So there's a number of ways you can provide access and build out an anchor institution, public and private, as well as a small business ecosystem.
That's great. And Della, while we're here, I know that you're doing a lot of work right now around access to capital and investment flows in particular. And you have been one of the people who really nationally is raising the attention on the lack of equity investment, in particular in Black and Brown owned businesses, the disproportionate focus on debt. Would love to invite you to talk more about this work in the investment space.
Okay, and here's why, Rachel. Is that if you took the same business plan and you gave it to a non-minority and you gave it to a minority, you will find that the non-minority can go to its network and probably aggregate $100,000 to $250,000 to go through the proof of concept and period of endurance. And as they go through those phases, they're able then to tap into angel investors and equity investors. So by the time they get their business to, let's say, 2 million in revenue, their capital stack has patient capital, very little debt, and they're positioned for either a larger investment or mezzanine financing. In the case of a non-minority with the same business plan, they have to go to CDFIs, micro lenders, small amounts of lenders, predatory lenders, credit card. So by the time they go through the period of endurance, their capital stack is all debt. And their debt to equity ratio is already thrown out of whack. And so by the time they get to 2 million in revenue, no one will touch them. Okay, so what we want to do is bring equity early on during that growth phase so that we can minimize the amount of debt that is laden their balance sheet and prohibits them from really growing. And so when you look at the acceleration of a minority business versus a non-minority, it is miles apart because of capital. And it is the number one disruptor in scaling minority enterprises. I meet plenty of minority enterprises across America. They're not small because they want to, but they're small because they don't have access to the capital to think big and scale up to a large business.
Thank you so much, Della. Did Emily and Saket, did you want to add anything to this question around investment flows? And if not, we'll go to one last question.
I forgot to mention, Rachel, capital flows where it knows. And so if it doesn't know underserved communities and it doesn't know the entrepreneurs in those underserved communities, capital doesn't flow there. And that's again where you need intermediaries who can bridge that gap and make sure that that capital flows to underserved communities, whether it's for infrastructure rebuilding or for the minority enterprises that want to grow and scale.
Yeah. Thank you, Della. So I'm going to combine two questions, one from Nefeli Morty and one from Mansa Collabs. And we'll just go around the horn and have this be sort of our final words. So the first is, what's one model that's really delivering an equitable jobs recovery or has the potential to, other than your own organization? So who should we all go, whose work do you admire or inspires you? It could be a particular city, it could be another nonprofit organization or business or social enterprise. And then two, from Nefeli, what is one piece of advice you would give to philanthropy and the role that philanthropy should be playing in this recovery? We know that TomTom is supported by a lot of different philanthropies. I'm coming from a philanthropy myself, so definitely one key part of the audience here. What advice would you give so that philanthropy can really show up in a useful way? Does anyone want to start?
Well, I'll start. Never in my almost 30 years at the Enterprise Center have I witnessed so many dollars coming out of Washington, D.C. Between budgets and stimulus. And I think that this is a moment in time in America where we need to get off the sidelines and really take advantage of that. So right now, if I had to applaud, it would be the Biden-Harris administration for thinking through how they target capital to distress, underserved. As Saket would mention, this announcement today around jobs and resiliency and mentioning, I think they're hitting on some key targeted areas in our economy, in America, that we need to participate in and take advantage of, because I've never seen this probably in my lifetime of these kinds of opportunities. I spoke to someone and said it probably hasn't been since Roosevelt or before then that we've seen these many, trillions of dollars being discussed in Washington. So I'd like to, think that we could really take advantage of this moment in time. So I'd like to say that I'm excited about the opportunities coming out of Washington.
Feeling excited for what's coming out of Washington it feels good. We need to feel that again. Della, do you want to give one quick tip for philanthropy?
Less programs and more investment capital.
Yes. Saket or Emily, would one of you like to go next?
Sure. I think there's a lot of groups doing really great work around equitable recovery and really thinking through some of these historical characteristics of low wage work that need to be corrected as we think about an equitable recovery. One that comes to mind is Working Washington. I know that they've really developed out some really creative and innovative models around working with gig economy workers. And that, so that jumps out to me as something is thinking about as there's these multiple trends, right? We have these frequent crises, climate disasters coming up, but then we also have this push within low-wage sectors and certain sectors towards greater instability and greater job insecurity around pushing more and more workers into the gig economy as independent contractors and stripping them away of their rights. And so thinking about groups that are thinking about how do we sort of reestablish or redefine the commitments that we as a society make and that are the baseline standards for work, and even stepping back from like the paradigm that like is not working right now around employer-employee relationships when so much work is being defined as independent contracting. So I think that there's some really innovative things. I think that those questions can be specific to certain sectors, but are really important for us to take on as we're thinking about an equitable recovery and how do we actually address some of those problems that preceded and that were really becoming deeply entrenched before the pandemic, and that taking those on is really critical and having a recovery that's going to be truly equitable, since we already had people just living paycheck to paycheck, not making ends meet. That like, what does that look like and how do we structure low wage work and provide that baseline standard?
Thank you so much, Emily. Since we're running short on time, Saket, I will go to you next.
Sure. Well, I think this is a moment to think very big, to dream about new rules for the economy, but to be sure to anchor those dreams in real places and test whether real lives are being improved. There are some really inspiring historical examples. For example, FDR and his engagement of the International Ladies Garment Workers Union. The New Deal allowed that union to grow and thrive. It created an extraordinary set of good jobs, mostly for women and immigrants. But it also created a legacy that lasted many generations coming out of that union. They owned a bank, they were able to create affordable housing. And I think that we have to be careful in this era not to let our highest aspirations end with a job at the end of a workforce ladder. It really should be generational. Our goals should be about how people pass along wealth. And so there are models, economic models for that even derive much from the private sector, but connect to government. A model, for unlocking philanthropic dollars that can further unlock much bigger federal dollars is sort of, I think, our theory of change. And in terms of what philanthropy can do, I would just say that there needs to be a policy ecosystem and a grassroots infrastructure that is needed to meet this moment in this way. There needs to be a DC-based federal policy infrastructure that puts racial justice and economic equity into recovery. And then on the ground, the grantees of philanthropy, if just funded a little more, could stretch to become that resilience infrastructure, but they can't do it yet. And so I would say that it doesn't take entirely new inventions from philanthropy. It just means both at the national and local level, allowing your work to stretch a bit so that we have the ecosystem and infrastructure we need to meet this moment.
Thank you so much. I think that's a very powerful note to end on. We need that policy ecosystem and the grassroots infrastructure. We have models that we can turn to, but it's about actually doing that and making sure this is happening in real places and that we're confident real people's lives are changing as a result. So thank you. Every time I speak with each of you, I'm just so inspired and grateful for your leadership and for your work and everything that you're building. And we'll end here. Ben, should I pass the final word to you?
Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you, Rachel. I just echo the gratitude to our panelists as well. If you missed any part of the session today, audience members, we encourage you to check out our YouTube channel where all of the conversations throughout this series will live on. Thank you, Della, Saket, Emily, Rachel, for being a part of this. And audience members, we'll see you at 3 at the next session.
Bye-bye.